Have you ever asked yourself what really happens after death? What awaits us on the other side? Will it be an infinite void or a reunion with something much greater? This doubt has accompanied humanity since the beginning, and today you will learn about a story that can change the way you see life and eternity. A child went through a near-death experience, NDE, and came back with a spiritual message that defies everything we know. What did she see in spiritual world? It is something that science cannot explain, but which is deeply connected to scriptures and divine teachings. The truth about life after death. It's always been a mystery, but does this experience reveal something God always wanted us to know? Many passages in the Bible talk about what awaits us beyond earthly life. Jesus said in John 14:2, "In my Father's house are many mansions." But has this child seen one of these addresses? Did she have an encounter with God, with angels, or with something that we are not prepared to understand? What makes this story even more surprising is that this child had no knowledge of what is written in the scriptures, but upon returning, he described something that is in line with biblical teachings. The hidden truth about death may be being revealed through these testimonies. Many have experienced NDEs and reported visions of heaven, meetings with deceased loved ones, divine messages, and even urgent warnings for humanity. But this report is different, as it comes from an innocent child, without external influences, without prior beliefs. If she described something so deep and spiritual, wouldn't that be confirmation that God wants to show us something? Every day, more people share similar stories. Are these reports a sign from beyond? Are we any closer to finding out the truth about death and what happens after that? What this child saw and heard could completely change our view of eternity. What if I told you that there is something that is being hidden from us, something that humanity has not yet understood? This story has a purpose, and you are part of it. Do you believe there is something greater beyond this life? So leave your like now. This way, this message reaches more people who need to hear it. Here, each story brings revelations that transform lives. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so as not to miss any real testimony that can strengthen your faith. Now stay until the end, because what this child revealed could transform your faith forever. His name was Caleb Anderson, a boy of just 7 years old, raised in a loving family that always taught him about God and the importance of prayer. Caleb was an energetic child, always curious about the world around him, but he could never imagine that on one seemingly ordinary day, his life would change forever. What happened that day made him experience something that few have the chance to experience. It was a peaceful day. The sun was shining brightly in the blue sky, and Caleb was playing in the backyard, running and laughing while kicking a ball against the wall. His mother watched him from the porch, smiling at seeing him so full of life. But suddenly something happened. Caleb stopped in the middle of the yard. His breathing became heavy, and a strong dizziness took over him. He tried to call for his mother, but his legs gave way, and before he could understand what was happening, his body fell to the ground, motionless. Desperation took over the house. His mother ran to him, shaking his small body, trying to wake him up. "Caleb, Caleb, please wake up." But there was no answer. His father ran out of the house, grabbed the phone, and called 911 while trying to remain calm. But something was wrong. The boy's chest no longer rose and fell. He wasn't breathing. Minutes later, the ambulance arrived and paramedics rushed to try to revive him. The pulse was weak, almost non-existent. Caleb's heart was stopping. His mother held his hand and prayed desperately, asking God to bring her son back. His father clutched the Bible to his chest, muttering verses through tears. But Caleb could no longer hear them. He was no longer there. The silence, a deep, absolute silence, as if all sound in the world had disappeared. Caleb felt his body become light, so light that it seemed to no longer weigh anything. He tried to move, tried to understand where he was, but there was no ground beneath his feet. He was floating. For a moment, the sensation was strange, as if he were in a dream, but something inside him told him it wasn't a dream. It was real. He looked down and, with an icy shiver, saw something that left him completely speechless. It was him. His own body was there, lying on the hospital gurney. Doctors were running around, nurses were holding machines. His mother was in the corner of the room with her hands on her face, sobbing desperately. Her father beside her held his Bible tightly, muttering prayers through tears. It was a scene of pure despair, but from where Caleb stood, he felt no fear, no pain. I felt peace. The white light from the hospital's spotlights seemed to shine in a different way. It was stronger, more intense, and as he floated higher, everything around him began to change. The hospital ceiling disappeared, the walls dissolved, and he felt a gentle warmth envelop his body. A light began to appear before him. But it wasn't an ordinary light. It wasn't just glare. It was something alive, something that pulsed with an energy he had never felt before. He wanted to look back. He wanted to go back, but the light was calling him. He felt he needed to go. A force was gently pulling him, as if invisible hands were holding him and carrying him forward. Then suddenly, everything changed. Caleb was now in a different place. There was no more hospital. There were no more doctors. There were no more machines beeping. He was in a vast golden field, where the ground seemed made of liquid light, where the air was so pure that every breath seemed to fill his soul. The sky above him was not blue, but rather a mixture of colors he had never seen before. It was as if space itself was alive. He looked around and noticed that everything there had its own shine. The trees glowed softly, as if they were made of liquid gold. The flowers seemed to sing a melody that played directly inside his heart. The wind wasn't just a movement of air. It was something that spoke to him, something that carried a message that he still couldn't understand. Nothing there was normal, but at the same time everything seemed more real than anything he had ever experienced before. It was then that Caleb felt a presence. He was not alone. In the distance, figures began to form, silhouettes that shone brighter than any star he had ever seen. They didn't walk, but they moved smoothly, as if they were gliding across the floor. He felt his heart, or whatever was inside him at that moment, speed up. He knew that those presences were not of this world. One of them came closer. Caleb tried to focus his vision, tried to see a face, but there was no face like the ones he knew. It was a form of pure light, radiating a peace so intense that he felt tears running down his face. But he wasn't sad. It was love. It was security. It was something human words could never describe. And then the voice came. A voice that was not spoken, but felt. A voice that filled everything around him, that seemed to be part of the air itself. Caleb, you need to understand. He didn't know what he needed to understand, but something inside him said that that presence wasn't there by chance. He hadn't gotten there by mistake. It was at that moment that everything around him shone even brighter. The field of light expanded. The sky twinkled as if responding to the voice, and Caleb felt he was about to see something that would change everything. But before he could ask anything, a new wave of heat enveloped him. He felt his body vibrate, felt something like a call coming from somewhere far away. He looked back, and in that instant, something broke the peace he felt. A pain, a distant sound, a strong pull, and then he heard something he didn't expect. Your mother. His voice cut through everything, crossed that golden space, calling out to him. He heard her sobs, heard his name being called out in despair. Caleb, please come back. Caleb, my son, God, bring him back. It was then that something changed. The presence before him remained, but Caleb felt something pulling him back. The pain returned. The tranquility began to disappear, and the place that once seemed so real began to disappear before his eyes. He didn't want to go. I wanted to stay. I wanted to understand. I wanted to see more. But something was pulling him back with an uncontrollable force. He tried to hold on to that light. He tried to stay where he was, but it was as if an invisible current was pulling him back, tearing him away from that place. Then, in an instant, everything went dark. The heat is gone. The glow disappeared. Peace was replaced by the brutal shock of reality. And then, the first sound he heard was a beep, then another. Machines. People talking loudly. A warm hand holding yours. Caleb opened his eyes, but it was no longer the same. What he saw, what he felt, what was shown to him, none of it could be explained in words. He knew something had happened, something much bigger than he could understand. This story did not come to you by chance. Do you believe Caleb really saw what lies beyond? That there is something greater than science can explain? Then write in the comments, I believe in the afterlife. And keep watching, because what Caleb saw and brought back will give you goosebumps. Caleb opened his eyes and realized it was still there. The heat that enveloped him was unlike any sensation he had ever experienced. It was like being immersed in pure love, as if every part of your being was being filled with a peace that didn't exist in the real world. He looked around and everything was grand, beautiful, and impossible to describe with human words. The ground beneath his feet seemed to be made of liquid gold, bright and shining, but when he touched it, he realized that it was neither solid, nor liquid, nor gaseous. It was something completely new, something that existed only there. He felt that this place was not like Earth. Time didn't pass the same way. He did not feel hungry, thirsty, or tired. It was as if he was in a state of pure existence, free from any physical limitations. In front of him, a path stretched out, and in the background there was a city, but it was no ordinary city. The towers and buildings were translucent and emanated a golden light, as if they were alive. There was no sun, but everything was shining, as if it were midday. The sky was not blue, but rather a mixture of indescribable colors, golden and silver tones that moved gently, as if in an eternal dance on the horizon. Caleb tried to understand where he was, but he couldn't come up with a single answer. He just felt it, and what I felt was overwhelming. The silence was absolute and at the same time full of sound. It was as if everything around was alive, as if the atmosphere itself was emitting a silent melody. These were not ordinary musical notes, but vibrations that went directly into his heart. He felt love in every particle of that place. It was as if he was standing before the Creator himself. It was then that he realized he was not alone. In the distance, figures began to appear. At first, they were just shadows, but as they got closer, they became clearer. They were beings of light. Their forms were human, but at the same time they were not. Their bodies glowed with an intense golden hue. Their robes seemed to be made of pure energy, and their eyes conveyed something Caleb had never seen before: infinite wisdom and absolute love. They didn't speak, but Caleb could hear them inside his own mind. They knew who he was, they knew everything about him, and yet they looked at him with indescribable love. He felt like he was coming home, like he had always belonged there. But at the same time, I knew I shouldn't be there. One of the beings approached and extended his hand to him. Caleb felt an energy pass through his body, something warm and comforting. It was then that a voice spoke within his soul. "You haven't finished your mission yet." He tried to understand what that meant, tried to ask something, but before he could react, his vision changed. He was no longer just on that golden field. Now he saw scenes before him. He saw people who had already left. He recognized a familiar face, someone he had never met in person, but whose image he had seen in photographs. It was his grandfather, who had passed away before he was even born. He smiled at Caleb, but said nothing. He just looked tenderly. Caleb wanted to run to him, wanted to hug him, but the environment around him changed again. Now he saw a river, but it was no ordinary river. The waters were crystal clear and seemed to be made of liquid light. Glowing fish swam gently, and the water emitted a sound reminiscent of heavenly singing. He felt the urge to touch that water, to dive into it, because he knew that if he did, he would understand something that he couldn't understand in the real world. But before he could take a step, another vision appeared. He saw a throne, a gigantic throne, made of light and surrounded by a glow so intense that your eyes couldn't focus directly on it. Caleb felt a deep awe rise within him. He knew who was there. He couldn't see a face because the light was too bright, but he felt an unmistakable presence. It was God. He was not a distant or unreachable figure. It was the essence of love itself. And then, everything around him seemed to stop. He felt an even greater warmth envelop him, and the voice came again, but this time it was different. "You need to go back." Caleb felt something inside him stir. He didn't want to go back. How could I want to? The peace he felt there was greater than anything he had ever known. There was no pain, there was no fear, just pure, absolute, infinite love. But at the same time, something inside him knew he couldn't stay. It was then that the light around him began to go out. The glow of the buildings became more distant. The light beings began to move away, and he felt as if he were being pulled back. He tried to resist, tried to stay there, but it was as if a greater force was pushing him back. And then he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. He saw his mother. She was kneeling beside his hospital bed, holding his little hand and crying desperately. He saw his father beside her, praying with his eyes closed, asking for a miracle. Caleb felt their pain, felt their despair, and in that moment something inside him broke. He couldn't leave them. Before he could make a decision, the voice came for the last time. "You still have a lot to do." And then Everything disappeared. The brightness of the sky, the river of light, the beings that surrounded him. The heat was replaced by an eerie feeling, and the absolute silence gave way to confusing noises. Suddenly, a strong impact went through his chest, as if something had violently pulled him back. The sound of machines beeping, voices agitated, the cold touch of hands pressing against your chest. Reality came back like a shock. He opened his eyes, but it was no longer the same. Caleb opened his eyes, but for a moment he didn't recognize where he was. Everything seemed strange, distorted, as if he had been ripped from a dream and thrown back into a world that no longer belonged to him. The first thing he felt was the weight of his own body, something that hadn't existed before. In that other place where everything was light, where he floated effortlessly, where there was no pain or fear, his body seemed to have no limit or weight at all. But now, lying in that hospital bed, it was different. His arms felt heavy, his breathing felt labored, and every muscle ached. Then he realized he wasn't alone. His mother's face came into his vision, her eyes red from crying. When she saw he was awake, a sob escaped her throat. She held his small hand tightly, as if afraid that he would disappear again. The father was there too, holding the Bible to his chest, his eyes filled with silent tears. The doctors looked at each other in surprise. It was as if no one there believed he had really returned. But Caleb knew. He knew he had been on the other side. He knew there was something that needed to be said. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak. His body was tired, exhausted. However, an urgency grew within him, an almost desperate need to tell what he saw, what he heard, what he felt. The message he received was still inside him, vibrating like an echo in his soul. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength. And then he remembered the last thing he heard before returning. The voice. That voice that wasn't exactly a voice, but rather something that spoke within his own existence. Something that echoed like an unquestionable truth. You still have a lot to do. These words were not just a warning. They were a mission. Something he needed to accomplish. Little by little he began to speak. His mother held her breath. His father leaned closer. The doctors stopped what they were doing. Everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. Caleb stared at the white ceiling of the hospital, trying to find the right words to describe something that seemed impossible to explain. He didn't know how, but he knew he needed to say exactly what he heard. He told about the light, about the place he visited, about the beings of light he encountered, but what caught everyone's attention the most was what came after. He said that while he was in that other world, he saw images. He saw things that seemed to belong neither to the past nor to the present, but rather to something that had not yet happened. He saw people he didn't know yet. He saw events he couldn't explain. But most of all, he heard the message. The first thing they told him was that life on Earth is not the end, that there is something greater waiting for us all. But it wasn't just that. He saw something about the future. He saw that many people were living without knowing the truth, without understanding that their actions in the present would have consequences beyond this life. He saw that the world was steeped in ignorance, trapped in material things, without realizing what really mattered. And then he heard the second message. Tell them to listen. Time is moving, and many still sleep. These words echoed within him, as if they had been engraved into his soul. He didn't know exactly what they meant, but he knew they were important. I knew I needed to share them. As he spoke, Caleb's mother squeezed his hand tighter. His father leaned in even closer to hear every detail, and the doctors exchanged silent glances. None of them knew how to react. It was as if that boy had returned with a message that no one was prepared to receive. But it wasn't just that. Caleb said he saw something even stranger. He saw people who were about to leave. He saw faces that looked familiar, and ones he had never seen before, but somehow he knew they were on a threshold, on the edge between this life and the next. Some seemed calm, ready to move on, while others seemed confused, scared. It was then that Caleb realized that most people I wasn't ready. They lived as if they had all the time in the world, without realizing that one day, sooner or later, everyone would cross that border. And then came the third message. Tell them to look within. The time to choose is getting shorter and shorter. Those words carried a weight he couldn't fully comprehend, but he knew they were true. Something was happening. Something was changing. He couldn't say what, but the feeling was clear. He said that when he heard this, he tried to ask what it meant. He tried to understand if it was a warning, if something big was about to happen. But before he could receive any more answers, the force pulling him back grew stronger. He tried to resist, tried to stay to learn more, but the voice said the last thing before everything disappeared. "You can't know everything. Just say what you saw." When Caleb finished speaking, the hospital room was silent. Nobody knew what to say. He looked at the faces around him, waiting for some reaction, but everyone seemed caught up in their own thoughts. His mother had tears streaming down her face. His father seemed even more firm in his faith, and the doctors seemed to be trying to find some logical explanation for all of this. But Caleb knew the truth. He didn't need them to believe him. He just needed to tell. That was his mission. Stories like this have a purpose. Do you believe Caleb was chosen to see beyond? Comment, "I believe in the mission and strengthen this truth. And there is still more to be revealed." What Caleb saw could change everything. Keep watching. The hospital room was plunged into silence. Everyone there was still trying to absorb the words Caleb had just said. The boy, with his gaze fixed on the white ceiling, breathed slowly, as if the experience he had just shared had drained all his strength. His mother still held his hand tightly, as if afraid he would disappear again. His father, standing by the bed, held the Bible tight to his chest, muttering silent prayers. The doctors and nurses looked at each other, trying to find some logical explanation for everything they had heard. But no one there could say anything, because deep down, everyone knew that something extraordinary had just happened. Caleb felt his body heavy, different from what he had experienced on the other side. The brightness, the lightness, the indescribable peace. It all seemed like a distant dream, but at the same time, more real than anything I had ever experienced. He knew he was back. He knew he was there, but something inside him said he would never be the same. There was something different. He felt it. The first days in the hospital were of recovery, but also of strange silence. His mother tried to smile, tried to act like everything was fine, but her eyes were always red from crying. His father stood next to him, reading passages from the Bible in a low voice, as if he wanted to find a verse that explained what his son had been through. The doctors, despite being relieved with the boy's recovery, were intrigued. Caleb shouldn't have come back to life so easily. His heart had stopped. His body had been without oxygen for a time that could have caused severe damage, and yet, there he was, speaking clearly with no apparent after-effects. It was as if he had been restored by something no one could understand. But the real change wasn't in his body. It was in your soul. From the moment he opened his eyes, Caleb knew something inside him had changed forever. The fear of death which any child would have after going through something like this simply didn't exist anymore. On the contrary, he felt an inexplicable peace whenever he thought about what he had seen. It was no longer a mystery to him. He knew what was on the other side. And this knowledge, far from frightening him, gave him a serenity that no child his age could understand. His parents noticed this change in the early days. Before, Caleb was a curious child, full of questions, but now it seemed like he already had all the answers inside him. His look was different, deeper, more attentive. He began to listen to conversations more patiently, to pay attention to people's words, as if he could see something beyond what they were saying. His mother, worried, asked him several times if he was okay, if he felt scared, if he wanted to talk about what had happened. But he just smiled in a serene way and said, "It's okay, Mom, I know I'm not alone." But what really started to draw attention was the way Caleb talked about God. Before his NDE, he listened to Bible stories with the curiosity of any child, but now he spoke about the Creator with a certainty that even the adults around him did not have. He didn't say, "I think God exists." He said, "I know." And when they asked how he could be so sure, he simply replied, "Because I felt it." And it wasn't just that. He went on to talk about love and forgiveness in a way that seemed beyond his years. Before, if someone upset him, he would get angry like any child, but now he seemed to understand something that others didn't. He said that holding a grudge was like carrying heavy stones in your heart, and that forgiveness was the key to lightness. His words were simple, but they struck a chord. His mother began to cry several times listening to her son speak. His father, a man who always had faith, began to believe even more. Something about Caleb had completely changed, but perhaps the most impressive thing was the way he knew things he shouldn't know. He began saying sentences that sounded like direct messages, as if he had come back with an understanding that didn't belong to a 7-year-old. One day, while holding his mother's hand, he looked at her and said, "Mommy, you don't have to be afraid anymore. You are not alone when you cry. There is someone who always listens to you." She was in shock. How did Caleb know that she cried in secret every night, praying to understand what had happened? How did he know that even though she was relieved to have him back, she still carried a deep fear of losing him again? His father also had a goosebump moment when Caleb, out of nowhere, looked at him and said, "Daddy, you don't need to worry so much. The path has already been written." The man remained motionless. Since the incident with his son, he had been carrying anguish inside him, wondering what he could have done differently, if he should have prayed more, if he should have protected Caleb in some way. But how did the son know this? How did he know about the questions his father asked only to himself, in the silent dawns when no one could hear? And the changes didn't stop there. As the weeks went by, Caleb began to show a type of sensitivity he hadn't had before. He could tell when someone was sad, even if they didn't say anything. He knew when someone was scared, when someone needed to hear a word of comfort, and he always knew what to say. A nurse at the hospital, who always came into the room smiling to cheer him up, one day had a surprise. When she came to change the IV and said a cheerful good morning, Caleb looked into her eyes and said, "There's no need to be afraid. He's fine." The woman stopped, turned pale. He had no way of knowing, but that morning before going to work, she had received a call that her brother had been in a car accident and was in serious condition. She tried to hide her concern, tried to act normal, but Caleb knew. He held her hand and smiled, and in that instant she felt a shiver run through her body. These little things started happening all the time. The people who crossed his path felt something different, something inexplicable. Caleb wasn't just a boy who survived something impossible. He had come back changed. From the moment Caleb came back to life, everything changed, but not just for him. His family, the doctors who treated him, the people who listened to his story, no one came away unscathed from what they witnessed. There was something different about the boy, something that transcended human logic. He spoke with a certainty that children his age shouldn't have. He not only believed in life after death, he knew it existed. His experience was not a theory, it was not a hypothesis or a belief. It was something he saw, felt, and lived. And this is a question that leads us to very deep reflection. How many people have gone through something similar and never had the courage to tell them? How many reports were ignored, treated as fertile imagination or simple delusions of a brain fighting death? But then, why are all these stories so similar? Why do so many people who have had near-death experiences report the same sensations, the same scenarios, the same encounters with beings of light, with deceased loved ones, with mysterious messages that seem to come from the Creator himself? Is it really a coincidence? If we look for reports around the world, we will find patterns that repeat themselves. People from different cultures, different beliefs, different ages, reporting that, at the moment of death, something happens. That consciousness does not disappear, that there is a place beyond this world, a place where peace is absolute, where love is more real than anything you have ever felt on earth. Many speak of a tunnel of light. Others describe an infinite field where everything vibrates in harmony. Some say they were received by angels. Others say they heard a voice that gave them a mission. And that's exactly what happened to Caleb. He saw, heard, and came back to tell. But are we ready to listen? Can our rational mind accept that there is something beyond matter, beyond what our eyes can see? Science has been trying to explain near-death experiences for decades, but to date has been unable to find a definitive answer. Some say they are hallucinations caused by a lack of oxygen in the brain. Others believe it is just a chemical reaction in the body at the time of collapse. But then, how can we explain when young children, without any religious influence or prior knowledge about spirituality, come back with reports so rich in details? How could a 7-year-old child come up with something so profound, something that makes so much sense to so many people around the world? And more than that, how to explain the changes that happen after an NDE? Because Caleb didn't just come back with an incredible story. He came back different, without fear of death, with an almost supernatural serenity, with words that directly touched people's souls. He knew things he shouldn't have known. I felt what people felt without them having to say anything. He no longer had the same worldview as he had before. He had seen something bigger, and if we stop to think about it, it's not just Caleb. There are hundreds, thousands of stories like this. Some are documented by doctors, others are testimonies from ordinary people who have had similar experiences. Some of them were convinced atheists before the NDE and came back believing in God. Others have seen visions of loved ones they never met, but later discovered they actually existed. Some reported seeing a border, a boundary that separated the living from the dead, and were given the choice to turn back or continue. But there's an interesting detail. Most people who come back transformed, as if they had received a gift, a new chance, and knew they needed to use it wisely. And that brings us to an even more important question. Are we living our lives the right way? Because if Caleb and so many others have truly seen what is on the other side, if there truly is something beyond death, then everything we do here matters. The decisions we make, the words we say, the way we treat others, all of this carries much greater weight than we realize. What if there really is a greater purpose? What if, just as Caleb heard, time is moving and many still sleep? Does this mean that we are wasting our existence worrying about passing things? Are we forgetting what really matters? The truth is, regardless of what you believe, Caleb's account makes us think. It makes us question our own journey. Are we ready to face the truth about what comes next? Are we prepared to understand that life does not end with death? Because one thing is certain, he didn't come back with any doubts. He came back with certainty. Now I want to hear from you. Have you heard other reports similar to Caleb's? Do you believe these experiences are real? If yes, comment, "I believe in life after death." If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message. And keep watching, because what Caleb still has to reveal could change your outlook on everything. This story found you for a reason. Nothing ends here, and there is much more to be revealed. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue this journey of transformation and discovery. Some experiences mark the soul and make us feel that there is something greater. Have you ever experienced something like this or know someone who has? Comment, "I believe in the mission," and show that this message also touched you. If this story made sense to you, leave your like now and help this truth reach those who need to hear it today. Something even more impactful is coming. The next video is now on your screen, and what will be revealed could change everything you believe. There are things that few have had access to, and now this truth is before you. Click now and continue this journey.